The village square is restless. A crowd gathers, murmuring like the wind before a storm. At the center stands a woman, her hands bound, her eyes fixed not on the people who surround her, but on the ground at her feet. She has not yet been tried, but already she is condemned. The punishment is not execution, not yet. First comes shame. First comes the slow, deliberate breaking of spirit. Across Europe, from the late Middle Ages into the early modern period, communities used public shaming as a weapon against those accused of witchcraft. These were not swift moments of judgment. They were performances, carefully staged to warn others. This is what happens if you step out of line. Imagine the cobbled streets of a German market town in the 16th century. Bells ring to summon neighbors from their homes. The town crier announces that an alleged witch will be displayed at dawn. By the time the sun breaks the horizon, the square is crowded with merchants, farmers, and curious children tugging at their mother's sleeves. No one wants to miss it. In these rituals, humiliation mattered more than pain. Authorities believed that stripping a person of dignity stripped them of power. Women accused of witchcraft were often paraded through streets, locked in pillories, or forced to wear grotesque signs of their supposed crimes. These punishments played on fear, superstition, and social control. They reminded every wife, daughter, and widow what would happen if they stepped outside the roles men had written for them. The pillory was one of the most infamous tools. Unlike the stocks, which locked only the feet, the pillory held the head and hands in an unyielding frame. The accused could not move, could not hide their face. They stood helpless as neighbors hurled rotten food, mud, or sharp stones. To some townsfolk, this was not merely punishment, it was entertainment. Markets swelled with laughter, jeers, and drunken singing while a human being stood frozen, branded by suspicion. In some regions, women accused of witchcraft were forced to wear tall paper hats covered with drawings of devils and serpents. Others wore wooden signs hung around their necks, painted with words like hex, German for witch. In France and Scotland, authorities sometimes shaved their heads, both to search for the devil's mark and to rob them of any feminine pride. Hair in that age was more than vanity. It was identity, a symbol of respectability and virtue. Stripping it away made the message clear: you are no longer one of us. Even water could be turned into a tool of disgrace. Accused witches were sometimes dragged to rivers or ponds for the infamous swimming test. Bound at the hands and feet, they were cast into the water to see if they would float. Floating was considered proof of guilt, because witches, people believed, rejected holy baptism and were repelled by pure water. Sinking suggested innocence, but there was no mercy in the test. Many drowned before they could be pulled out. In England, the cucking stool, also called the ducking stool, was originally used to punish scolds, women accused of gossiping too freely. As witchcraft fears rose, this same device humiliated women suspected of sorcery. The accused was strapped into a wooden chair at the end of a long beam and dunked repeatedly into cold water, not to kill, but to terrify and shame. Crowds roared with laughter while the woman sputtered and gasped, her skirts clinging heavily, her dignity washed away with each plunge. Shaming rituals worked because they left no scar on the flesh, but deep scars on the spirit. In many cases, they were precursors to harsher interrogations. A woman publicly disgraced would find few allies when her case went before the courts. Fear turned neighbors into accusers. Once you were shamed, you were marked. Even acquittal could not wash it away. These spectacles were not always the work of official courts. Sometimes they sprang from the people themselves, angry mobs eager to take justice into their own hands. In small villages, accusations of witchcraft often began with whispers. Milk gone sour, crops failing, a child falling sick. Rather than wait for distant authorities, villagers might drag a suspected witch from her home and stage their own ritual. A night of jeering, of forced confessions, of public humiliation in the town square. By morning, her reputation was destroyed, her family ruined, her fate sealed. Women bore the brunt of these punishments not by accident, but by design. In a society ruled by strict expectations of female obedience, any woman who lived alone, spoke too boldly, or failed to marry could arouse suspicion. The rituals of shame reminded everyone watching that order must be preserved. A good woman stayed silent, loyal, and fearful. A bad woman became the village spectacle. One chilling example comes from Rothenburg, Germany, in 1587. Records describe a woman accused of brewing potions and speaking curses. Before her trial, she was paraded through the streets wearing a heavy wooden block around her neck engraved with the word hex. Children were encouraged to follow her, to chant and mock. By the time she reached the courthouse, she was already convicted in the eyes of the town. Her humiliation was part of the evidence. In other cases, shaming rituals took the form of witch processions. The accused would be led on foot through every street of a village, sometimes barefoot, sometimes forced to carry heavy stones as penance. Neighbors would spit or strike her as she passed. In Catholic regions, church bells sometimes rang during these processions, not to protect her, but to signal to everyone that a dangerous soul was being cleansed in public view. These punishments blurred the line between justice and theater. They were meant to frighten, but also to entertain. And they worked. Ordinary people, who might never have spoken to a judge or magistrate, were drawn into the drama. Children learned early that witches were not just burned at stakes. They were broken first, piece by piece, in front of everyone they had ever known. Such rituals were rooted in superstition, but they also served political ends. Town leaders used them to assert control, to display moral authority, and to keep women especially in their proper place. By turning punishment into public performance, they enlisted entire communities as witnesses and accomplices. When the time finally came for trials and executions, no one doubted the guilt of the accused. Shame had already done its work. Even after the great witch hunts began to fade in the 18th century, echoes of these rituals survived. In some rural towns, women accused of lesser offenses, gossip, infidelity, or petty theft, still faced public humiliation in stocks or stools. The medieval idea lingered, that shame could cleanse society, that ridicule was as powerful as the sword. But in truth, these punishments did not cleanse, they corrupted. They turned neighbors into enemies. They gave fear a stage and let cruelty take a bow. For every woman who endured the pillory or the cucking stool, dozens more learned to stay quiet, to obey, to never draw attention. Public shame kept entire communities in line, long after the accused had disappeared. The rituals of public humiliation were not just punishments. They were performances, crafted to strike terror into the hearts of entire communities. Once an accused which had been paraded, mocked, or forced into symbolic penance, the ordeal often escalated into something even more elaborate. These were events where fear, faith, and cruelty converged in the town square. Imagine a marketplace at midday, crowded with merchants, children darting between stalls, and travelers passing through. Suddenly, a bell tolls, a sound not of worship, but of warning. People abandon their tasks to gather in a rough circle. Soldiers arrive, their boots thudding against the cobblestones, followed by a priest holding a heavy Bible, his eyes fixed on the ground as though even he fears what's about to take place. At the center is the accused woman. She has been stripped of all symbols of her former life. No jewelry, no bonnet, not even shoes. Her hair, once carefully braided, hangs loose and matted, deliberately left untended to signify moral decay. This was no accident. Authorities understood the power of imagery. By presenting her as disheveled and broken, they made her an object lesson rather than a human being. In some towns, women accused of witchcraft were forced to wear specific garments during these humiliations. Rough sackcloth tunics, sometimes marked with red crosses or depictions of devils. The fabric scratched against the skin, adding physical discomfort to public shame. A pointed hat or wooden sign might hang from the neck, bearing words like sorceress or enemy of Christ. These items were designed to turn every gaze into a weapon, every onlooker into an accomplice. The pageantry served a purpose. It was not enough to punish the individual. The ritual had to reaffirm the power of church and magistrate. Public degradation was theater, and the audience was meant to leave with a lesson burned into memory. Step out of line, and this will happen to you. One common ritual involved the Walk of Penance. The accused was marched through every street of the village, often barefoot on sharp stones or muddy ground. Bystanders threw refuse, rotten vegetables, manure, even sharp stones, while children followed, chanting cruel rhymes. The route deliberately passed key landmarks: the church doors, the guild hall, and the town well, as if to show that every pillar of society condemned her. In some regions, bells were rung or horns blown as she passed, so that no one could ignore the spectacle. But the humiliation did not stop at clothing or processions. In parts of Germany and France, towns crafted grotesque masks of iron or wood to place over the accused woman's head. These were not instruments of torture in the modern sense but devices of mockery. Long noses, painted flames, or leering faces to represent the devil. Sometimes they included small bells so the accused could be heard long before she was seen. The mask announced her guilt even before the trial concluded. Consider the shame stool, a device placed in public squares or at the edge of local ponds. A woman forced onto the stool might be jeered at for hours, her neighbors circling like vultures. In Scotland, a similar device called the cucking stool or ducking stool was used to dunk suspected witches into freezing water, not primarily to test guilt, but to make an unforgettable scene. Whether she floated or sank mattered less than the crowd's cathartic release of fear and anger. These punishments were rooted in a deeper cultural fear, that women accused of witchcraft were not just individuals who had sinned, but symbols of rebellion against divine and civic order. Public shaming transformed neighbors into participants, ensuring that fear spread evenly among the community. Every mother watching would tell her daughter, "Obey, conform, keep your head down." The rituals also reveal how accusations targeted the most vulnerable, widows, midwives, or outspoken women who lived without male protection. Their public degradation was intended to erase any dignity they still held. In some cases, women were even forced to confess their supposed crimes aloud, repeating words fed to them by magistrates, while the crowd hissed and jeered. Imagine being compelled to describe impossible dealings with the devil while staring into the furious eyes of people you once called neighbors. One chilling account from a German village tells of a woman paraded with a rope around her neck while carrying a heavy candle as penance. The candle, taller than her arm, dripped hot wax onto her skin as she walked. The symbolism was deliberate, the light of faith burning against the darkness of witchcraft. When she stumbled, guards yanked the rope to keep her moving, as if jerking a puppet on a string. Elsewhere in Europe, accused witches were forced to kneel at the doors of churches at dawn, begging forgiveness from passing townsfolk. Each refusal of mercy reinforced the idea that she was beyond redemption. Sometimes entire congregations were ordered to spit on the ground as they passed, a ritual as cruel as any physical beating. The language surrounding these punishments was as harsh as the actions themselves. Official proclamations spoke of cleansing and purifying the village, as though the accused were a plague to be washed away. Trials and penance rituals were often announced days in advance, turning them into grim festivals of fear. Merchants sold food, children laughed, and traveling performers sometimes used the gathering crowds for their own gain, all while a human life unraveled before their eyes. What made these events so powerful was their blend of faith and fear. In the minds of villagers, the devil was not an abstract force but a living presence, whispering in the ears of neighbors and hiding behind familiar faces. Watching an accused witch suffer was more than justice. It felt like spiritual warfare, a visible victory over darkness. Even the aftermath of these rituals left lasting scars. Women who survived public shaming rarely found peace. They were shunned in markets, avoided at wells, and sometimes driven from their homes entirely. Families who spoke in their defense were suspected of witchcraft themselves. The humiliation was designed to linger, to echo long after the event itself, serving as both punishment and permanent warning. In some cases, these rituals foreshadowed even darker fates. Public penance was sometimes used as a step before execution, a way of softening both the accused and the crowd for what came next. By the time a woman was led to the stake or scaffold, she was already broken in body and spirit, her humanity stripped away piece by piece through days of ritualized shame. The entire process reveals the true purpose of these punishments. They were not random acts of cruelty but carefully orchestrated displays of power. Each element, the bell, the rope, the sackcloth, the mocking crowd, worked together like parts of a grim machine. The accused was not just being punished. She was being transformed into a living sermon, a warning that no one could miss. Even centuries later, these rituals still haunt us. They remind us how fear can warp communities, how ordinary people can become willing participants in cruelty when authority and superstition demand it. They also reveal how women's bodies and reputations were weaponized, turned into public battlegrounds where power and faith clashed. When we walk through old marketplaces or stand in front of stone churches that once witnessed these events, it's easy to imagine the echo of bells and the shuffle of feet gathering for another grim procession. And if we listen closely, perhaps we can hear something else. The faint, unbroken voices of those who endured, calling out to be remembered not as villains, but as victims of fear disguised as righteousness.